Okay, thanks everyone for being here tonight at Citizen Climate Lobby Canada's November 2021 call. It's our educational call, and tonight we have with us Dr. Sanjiv Mathur. But before I start, I would first like to do a land acknowledgement and acknowledge that I am a grateful settler on Robinson Huron Treaty territory. I respectfully acknowledge that the work I support stretches across the homes of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people collectively known here on Turtle Island. If you feel comfortable and wish to share the lands upon which you are calling in from, so we can get to know each other across Canada, please feel free to do so in the chat. For those of you who want to know how to, I will put that in the chat. I don't know if you saw this week's speech by Canada's new Governor General in the speech from the throne, but she said something that was very interesting. Okay, I saw that message in the chat. Okay, I'll fix that. Before I do that, this week, Her Excellency, the Right Honorable Mary Simon, Governor General of Canada, delivered the speech from the throne to formally open the first session of the 44th Parliament of Canada. In her speech, she reminded us all the following: there is hope in every day. Reconciliation is not a single act, nor does it have an end date. Now on to our evening. I'll introduce our guests. Dr. Sanjiv Mathur is an anesthesiologist at Health Sciences North here in Sudbury, Ontario. He's also an associate professor at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. His research interests include cardioprotection and environmental medicine. He has several publications and has presented at the Canadian Anesthesiologist Society, International Anesthesia Research Society, the American Anesthesiologist Association, and the New York Postgraduate Assembly in the past few years on the impact of anesthesia on the environment. He's an invited speaker and lecturer on the impact of medicine on the environment. He is on the founding board of the Canadian Anesthesiologist Society for Environmental Sustainability chapter, and he's also on the Ontario Anesthesiologist Sustainability chapter. He's also a board member of CCL Canada, and he has served as the president of the Sudbury Medical District Society and as a member of the Ontario Medical Association Council, serving as a delegate for Northern Ontario. He's participated in the medical assistance dying file, and he's a lead physician in providing service within Health Science North. He's also the co-founder and co-director of the acute pain service at Health Sciences North, focusing on perioperative analgesia and safety. He's also founded the blood conservation program at Health Sciences North and has sat on the boards of the Ontario Blood Advisory Committee and Ontario Nurse Transfusion Committee. And he's the chair of the Transfusion Committee at Health Sciences North. Without further ado, I am going to hand this over to Sanj. Take it away, Sanj.
Hello there. Thank you for attending this talk. I think I'll get started because I know we have 20 minutes and I think I have a pretty full presentation. So my talk today will be reducing our contribution to climate change. Our choice of anesthetic matters. And this was a slide I presented to anesthesiologists. So I followed that up with, are we responsible for the gas we pass? Just to give a brief background, Kathy and I, of course, met in undergrad sciences. Both of us had an interest in the environment, but it really wasn't until the movie An Inconvenient Truth where we really realized how dire the situation was. And on the left, you can see the similarities between our smokestack and the movie ad. And of course, there's our other climate warrior, Sophia Mathur, we promised to try to make a better world for. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background about why I studied this. And of course, this goes to the field of anthropogenic climate change. The World Health Organization, of course, calls climate change the greatest threat to global health in the 21st century. And then, of course, there's the Intergovernmental Panels on Climate Change, which have produced several reports. If you could summarize the conclusions that have existed in each report, most of them are obvious to us. That the warming of the climate is unequivocal, unprecedented. We all know that the atmosphere and the ocean has warmed. That has had major effects. But one conclusion people often go over is that they said that the total radiating force is positive. And I want you to remember that phrase. And has led to an uptake in energy by the climate system. And that was one of their conclusions. And we'll go over that in a few minutes. The other thing that's obvious to us all here is that the human influence is clear. This is evident from, of course, the increasing greenhouse gases. But again, they reminded us from the positive radiative forcing, as well as the fact that we observe the warming and we understand the climate system. So a few times they mentioned this radiative forcing. The medical literature also supported us to look within our medical practices. In 2015, the Lancet Commission on Health and Climate Change gave 9 recommendations, and the last one included empowering health professionals to make a positive environmental changes in their practices. Meds Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, said that climate change is the greatest global health threat to the 21st century. So it is incumbent that all physicians take a stand to protect their patients. Our CMA policy paper, in large part supported by Dr. Howard, said that healthcare professionals should act within the professional settings to reduce the environmental impact of medical activities and to develop environmentally sustainable professional settings. This was supported in many mainstream journals, including the American Family Medicine, British Medical Journal, and et cetera, emergency medicine, pediatrics. Many journals came out forth and asked physicians to look within our practices and see what we could do. I like what the Journal of American Medical Association said, that clinicians have a powerful and unique opportunity to engage the nation by framing the crisis as a health imperative. And I really saw a lot of that at COP26 in Scotland, where there were a lot of physicians and a lot of people talking about the health imperative from all aspects, and to reduce our carbon intensity and energy consumption at work and at home. But at work was the key for me. So I decided to take all this and start to look at my practice and what I could do in anesthesia. And lo and behold, I found an article published in 2012 that none of my colleagues that I worked with were aware of. And that was assessing the impact of global climate from General Anesthetic Gases. And this article was published in 2012, but was published by atmospheric science experts and jet propulsion laboratory experts in California, who are quoted in the IPCC and are pretty well the world experts on atmospheric sciences and compounds. In this article, we're all well aware of how global warming works, and of course, the fact that most of the outgoing heat from the sun to the earth is absorbed by greenhouse gas molecules and re-emitted in all directions, causing the warming of the surface of the earth in the lower atmosphere. So that's kind of the basics, but it's a bit more detailed than that. This is a very complex slide, and I only want to focus on a few things. One, that what exists in the atmosphere, mostly that it's greenhouse gases, are water and CO2, and they are present in tremendous amounts in the atmosphere and therefore have a huge effect on greenhouse gas effect. But these funny lines down here, the red, the blue, and the light gray, are the anesthetic gases. And unfortunately, they reside in something called the atmospheric window. This window in the atmosphere is an area of which compounds have an exceptionally strong, powerful effect on radiating heat back or to the system, or basically are very strong greenhouse gases. So it's not just how much gas you put in the atmosphere, it's where those gases reside and exert the radiative forcing. So radiative forcing is a measure of how an agent alters the balance of incoming and outgoing energy in the atmosphere. Halogenated organic compounds made by man, not just anesthetic gases, but other ones, actually produce 10 to 15% of the man-made radiative forcing of the climate. So again, these anesthetic gases are extremely potent greenhouse gases. They do exist without a question in minuscule concentrations versus anthropogenic CO2 from global fossil fuel combustion, but don't forget they do exert a very positive radiating force. And therefore, you can't just look at what percentage is in the atmosphere, it's what it's doing in the atmosphere. This is a very busy table, so we're only going to concentrate on a little bit of it. On the far left, you see the compounds that we use in anesthesia. I'm only going to concentrate on the last two, which are the most common anesthetics used, DESFLURANE and sevoflurane. Right off the bat, you can see the problem for DESFLURANE versus sevoflurane, that it lasts in the atmosphere 14 years versus 1.1 in sevoflurane. The next table is the radiative efficiency, and this is how the atmospheric scientists actually measure how effective the agent is in radiating heat back into the system. And as you can see, DESFLURANE is by far worse than sevoflurane. Atmospheric scientists then go ahead and calculate what they call the global warming potential to compare the effects of agents in the atmosphere. So they're not looking at parts per billion or parts per million. They calculate the global warming potential. And they do it at a 20-year, 100-year, and 500-year lifetime. Most atmospheric scientists use a 100-year lifespan. So I'm just going to summarize that nasty table into one. CO2 is set at 1 for its terms of its global warming potential. That table also told us that methane has 21 global warming potential, or as most of us know, 21 times worse than CO2. You can see our anesthetic gases have a much more profound effect. Nitrous oxide or laughing gas, sevoflurane are quite bad, but DESFLURANE is quite exceptionally potent as a greenhouse gas, being 2,540 times greater global warming potential than CO2. I also want to note to you that's in the 100-year lifespan. I'm probably not going to be around in 100 years. If I looked at my 20-year lifespan of the DESFLURANE, that if I was put in the atmosphere now, it's actually well over 6,000 times the global warming potential of a CO2 molecule. I found that didn't resonate with a lot of people because we're talking about global warming potentials and parts per billion and units that aren't familiar with people. So I converted it into driving equivalency. So if an anesthesiologist works 7 hours in the operating room and he delivered the dose of sevoflurane that keeps people asleep, 2% sevoflurane, that was equivalent of getting into a car that gets 28 miles per gallon, so a pretty efficient car, and driving 40 kilometers. If that same anesthetist spent 7 hours in the operating room and used 6% DESFLURANE, which is the sleep dose for DESFLURANE, it was equivalent to getting in the car and driving from Niagara Falls to Halifax, or 1,920 kilometers. That's literally one anesthesiologist, one OR, one day. And I found that resonated with people a lot more. A lot of people did argue, however, that we're there to protect our patients and that DESFLURANE had some benefits, and really the most important thing for us to do is to take care of the patient in front of us. But I like this comment by Dr. Sherman of Yale, who Kathy and I have, she's talked at CCL meetings, and Susan Ryan, who said that anesthesiologists put patients first, and that is what responsible doctors do. But the patient is more than a human being under our immediate care. The patient includes the family, the neighbors, the community, the country, and the world. Our patient is all of humanity. Accepting responsibility for the environmental stewardship is putting the patients first. And I think that's an important concept. Now, what I've shown you is a lot of numbers and charts and calculations from organic chemists and atmospheric scientists. But somebody actually took the effort to go measure this stuff in the atmosphere. So Dr. Vollmer and his gang, for a full year in 2014, put flasks in the atmosphere. He did one in the remote sites in the Northern Hemisphere. He put them on icebreaker research vessels in the North Pacific. There's an area called the High Altitude Observatory in Switzerland that's supposed to be a good atmospheric footprint for Europe itself, and he put flasks there, and as well as a South Korean research station in Antarctica, and he measured how much of this stuff is in the atmosphere and calculated their carbon footprint. What he measured in that 1 year in his samples was a total of about 3.1 million tons of CO2 equivalents. And sadly, 80% of that came from the agent DESFLURANE. You have to remember that DESFLURANE does not exist in all countries. It is actually a fairly new drug compared to sevoflurane and the other ones mentioned there. And that a lot of the developing nations are just getting this drug. Yet it still already represented 80% of what was out in the atmosphere that was causing greenhouse gas effect. So then I looked at what was going on in Sudbury, Ontario, and we do about 12,500 cases per year, not including cataracts because we don't use any anesthetic gases for cataracts. And what I found out was that the carbon dioxide equivalents for sevoflurane in this 1 year, if you convert it to driving, was equivalent to driving a 28 mile per gallon car, 132,000 kilometers in 2016. And I gave the cash amount there for the administrators. The carbon dioxide equivalent for DESFLURANE, however, was equivalent of driving over 3 million kilometers for about the same price and about a 50-50 ratio. So over 3 million kilometers alone in 1 year at Health Sciences North. I then wanted to put this into perspective of an individual anesthesiologist. So as most of us know the numbers, in 2013, and pretty well not that different now, 35 million Canadians produce about 720 megatons of CO2 equivalents. That works out to about 20.6 tons per person. Individuals actually only release about 5 to 9 on their individual practice and lifestyle, because a lot of that has to do with infrastructure. It is very difficult to make a difference in this. In fact, the government of Canada used Rick Mercer for a while to do a 1-ton challenge, and eventually took the site down because it was almost disappointing that converting from not using your dryer and doing a few things like that really had a hard time bringing your tonnage down. Of course, it's still good to do, and I'm not in any way discouraging it, but it's difficult to actually bring your tons down other than doing some of the major things. But if I look at the average anesthesiologist at Health Sciences North who is working 225 work days and 7.5 hours a day, if they use DESFLURANE every day and then switch to sevoflurane every day, they reduce their impact by 105 tons. So the individual anesthesiologist can have a very significant drop in their carbon footprint. As I told somebody who used DESFLURANE, it doesn't make sense for you to bike to work or you to take your Prius and then use DESFLURANE all day. We then found a surgeon, Dr. Antonio Cancedo, who also spoke at the CCL meeting international, not USA, and looked at individual cases. So taTME is a procedure that we do to remove rectal cancers, and they usually take a long time, and you can only do 2 a day in the operating room. So we reviewed every single taTME case that was done between January 2017 and January 2018 at Health Sciences North for about 18 months. And we calculated the carbon dioxide equivalents and how many kilometers that was equivalent to using a Yale app that they developed to help calculate this very accurately by Dr. Sherman, actually. And since DESFLURANE advertises itself to being a better drug because patients wake up quicker, we measure how well people wake up by something called the Aldrete score. And when you have an Aldrete score greater than 9, it means you're awake enough to leave recovery room and move onwards. So then we also looked at whether or not there was actually any benefit of DESFLURANE from that perspective. So what we published in this was that DESFLURANE was by far obviously a much higher carbon footprint than sevoflurane, having over 400 carbon dioxide equivalent tons put in the atmosphere versus sevoflurane, which was about 15. In terms of kilometers, that was equivalent of taking a car from Toronto and driving it that same Halifax, but 1,700 kilometers. When you did one case on one patient for a rectal cancer during the taTME procedure with DESFLURANE. If you did 2 in a day, which is not uncommon, that was they're driving there and back. Sevoflurane was about 40 kilometers or driving from one end of the city of Sudbury to the other. So quite a significant difference, even in an individual procedure, if you're thinking about it. So now we've shown that, as a Health Sciences North and as an individual procedure, there is a tremendous increase in the carbon footprint. I should have mentioned here that also there was no benefit in terms of the Aldrete score. The DESFLURANE had no benefit on the patient's outcomes, their morbidity, their mortality, their side effects of heart, lung issues, and it did not improve their ability to get out of the recovery room. It did absolutely increase their carbon footprint. But what does this mean in terms of the whole operating room? We know that hospitals themselves have huge amount of emissions and have a lot of pollution. How do anesthetic gases relate to the overall study of the operating theater? And thankfully, Dr. McNeil, a BC surgeon, actually published this in the Lancet. In Hospital A here on the far left, we have Victoria Hospital. And as you can see, even when you take the energy, which includes every part of energy from heating the water to heating the rooms to HVAC systems and everything. Supply chain and waste takes into everything from delivery of goods to the hospital, the use of the hospital, throwing in the garbage, and the recycling carbon footprint. So this was an incredible, extensive study that took years, actually. And you can see, even with all that taken into consideration, anesthetic gases were by far the greatest contributor to the greenhouse gas effect of the operating room in Victoria. The next hospital is in Minnesota, and you see a bit of a shift away. Now, Minnesota uses a lot of coal fire in this particular hospital. So this is a hospital that has a lot of carbon footprint from one of the worst sources of energy, coal. And even with that knowledge, anesthetic gases was by far the greatest contributor to the carbon footprint. The last one was in the UK, the John Radcliffe Hospital in the UK. And I think that Dr. Nell is on this call, and he'd be able to tell you why is the anesthetic gases so small here at 4%, and energy a much bigger component. They don't use DESFLURANE at this hospital. So by removing DESFLURANE, the anesthetic gas became a much smaller component. Imagine the incredible scenario that I've tried to get calculated in Sudbury, Ontario, where our energy is actually quite low in terms of its carbon footprint, and we don't use DESFLURANE. Our total amount of carbon footprint compared to these hospitals would be less than a quarter. So how do you go about making the changes of getting rid of DESFLURANE? In this slide is we call the hierarchy of effectiveness. How effective are things to do to make changes or institute either changes in medications or just making decisional changes as an organization? And sadly, we've learned now in a lot of fields, including medicine, that education is actually a very poor value. If you look at the far left, or low leverage or least effective policies, education is actually quite poor. And that is actually something that I found, and I'm going to show you in a few minutes. For a full year, I did education sessions to multiple rounds, meetings that Kathy mentioned. We published, and we got this spread around to a lot of people. We then did something called a medium leverage, which are reminders. So we put warning stickers on all the DESFLURANE vaporizers, reminded people of the impact of it. Also, every month or so, I would put it up in the lounge, but the difference in the carbon footprint of that month in the operating room between DESFLURANE and sevoflurane. And that had some effect. Third of all, we did automation or computer automation, a high leverage system-based change. That is, we removed vaporizers from the machines, and you were automatically had to go to a machine, use your fingerprint to get DESFLURANE out of the machines. It would be documented you took it, load the machine up yourself on the anesthetic machine, and then use it. That, of course, had quite a significant real effect. And our final forcing function, which are the most effective and successful way of changing things, is to just simply not order DESFLURANE on our formulary. So we removed DESFLURANE from our formulary. So how did that work out? In this slide on the left, we see the carbon dioxide equivalents from Health Sciences North operating room from the anesthetic gases. In green is the effect of DESFLURANE. In blue is the effect of sevoflurane. So I started off with the education sessions, and we moved from high 700s, and we did come down a bit in 2017 from the education, and a little bit more when we put the stickers and had some other sort of reminders. But as I'm sure everyone here who works in the environment knows, you're often preaching to the converted. And many environmental people already kind of knew about this. So there was some change, but not a lot of quick pace in 2 years. When we started to move to high leverage things and actually make people sign it out, and then finally got rid of it, we obviously reduced the carbon footprint of DESFLURANE to 0. And then sevoflurane had a small bump. The total carbon footprint for the operating would be the additions of these lines. And you can see we made a dramatic drop. We've actually reduced our annual greenhouse gas emissions by over 700 tons by getting rid of DESFLURANE. We actually ended up reducing our budget of anesthetic agents too, which made the pharmacy and the administrators happy. In what we can measure, although we did not have a study for it, we noticed no change in the morbidity nor mortality in getting rid of DESFLURANE, and we have had no change in the turnover of recovery rooms as a whole. And we showed in that one study, neither did we have it in the taTME procedure. So it doesn't appear that we have made a big difference in patient outcomes, but we have improved our carbon footprint. So we've solved the problem, right? Well, no. Unfortunately, that happened in Sudbury, Ontario, where we have an excellent relationship between doctors and pharmacists and the team. members, administration. And of course, as we all know, in Northern Ontario, we're very friendly and get along great. I have many physicians who are trying similar things in Toronto. This is the most recent data by Dr. Nam in Toronto, who then looked at the carbon footprint in the GTA. So in blue, it's DESFLURANE, yellow sevoflurane. You can see the Michel Guerin Hospital, the Trillium Health Partnership, the University Health Network, Mount Sinai. All the hospitals in Toronto still have a huge increase in the DESFLURANE contribution. So what are they going to do? Are they going to go back and do the things that I did, educate, have rounds, put stickers on, fight for, then that gives you a bit of momentum to fight for putting in the PICSIS and all that. It's a very difficult process that it's going to take too long. But is pricing carbon a better forcing function? At the bottom of the slide, the journal actually made us include it in the slide, so it's very hard to actually see. So I'll just use the numbers. In 2020, at $30 a ton of carbon dioxide equivalents, this would increase the price of sevoflurane $1.48 a bottle and DESFLURANE $26.82 a bottle. They currently cost about $140 each. So it would have a minimal effect on sevoflurane, but a significant effect on the DESFLURANE budget right away. Some that would probably make a difference. We order this year, we did the study, 800 bottles of DESFLURANE, 600 bottles of sevoflurane at the first time we did our measurements. So pharmacy also would recognize that difference. What we do know is we're going to be ramping up the carbon price. In 2030, it's going to go up to $170 a ton. That will change sevoflurane $8.39 a bottle, and DESFLURANE would more than double its cost. So we think this is more of an ultimate forcing function in the sense that DESFLURANE will no longer be competitive, and then no hospital, pharmacy, or formulary would even carry it unless you could prove it had value to the patients, which they can't, and which studies have not shown. When we were at the COP26, we saw Dr. Howard give an excellent presentation, but she also presented in the Lancet, and she presented these 7 points, which I think are amazing. Her presentations are always enjoyable to watch. And I think number 5 was very key, is that we have to enact a strong carbon pricing program. The Canadian Medical Association, Canadian Chamber of Commerce, energy and mining leaders support this, and it has to be included in the healthcare system, or we're not going to get changes quick enough. We've all heard about carbon capture systems and trading schemes. So versus the carbon pricing system where we just simply make DESFLURANE non-competitive, there has been a device discovered and made actually in Canada, which can be added to the back of the machine and actually take out the anesthetic gases so they never go into the atmosphere. That sounds amazing. But here's the problem. What do you do with it once in here? What was happening in the few hospitals in the GTA that signed up for this is a truck drove around every day and collected these, put on brand new ones, and then stored the other ones in a storage facility. That, of course, has a lot of waste, a lot of driving, and you actually haven't solved the problem because the gas still exists and one day could get out. They, of course, have been advertising that one day they're going to get FDA approval to reuse this gas. They could isolate it and make it again available to be used clinically. But nobody knows for sure if that's safe. This is being in the patient with COVID or prions, that kind of stuff. How are you sure you're getting rid of everything when you clean it out and redistribute it to other patients? Once again, the failed promises of capture systems comes through here. One of the hospitals then asked for a detailed report of how much they were actually saving with this delta absorber, because it's quite expensive and nobody's paying for it other than the hospital budget. And they found out that OR5 actually ended up saving quite a bit of carbon dioxide equivalents. The problem was that OR5 was their cataract room. And if you remember earlier, cataracts use no gases at all. So there were absolute errors in the reporting system. That's always one of the concerns I have by capture systems and trade schemes. So what does it ask of politicians? We want to have the anesthetic gases added to the greenhouse gas inventory, and thus be subject to the carbon pricing mechanisms, because at this time it is not. And with that, there'll be a very quick forcing function of making DESFLURANE non-competitive. And I think that's why I'm approaching CCLers. The physicians, as Kathy mentioned, CASES, or the Anesthesiology Society for Environmental Sustainability, and Ontario Anesthetics have contacted politicians and tried to get this message across. But But I think what we need to use is the success and the relationships that CCL has already created and a successful way of training people so that we could utilize CCL's expertise to get this done. Thank you for that perspective.
Thank you, Sanjiv. That was very informative and very helpful. I'm going to open it to questions, but I have one question myself, if I may start. And I'd like to know, do Canadian drug companies produce either of these drugs?
The main companies are actually not Canadian owned, no. But they have facilities in Canada that make the drugs and distribute it. So there is an Abbott Canada and a Baxter Canada that takes these drugs and distributes it, but they're actually made in facilities outside of Canada.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Katerina.
Thank you. I'm wondering if there's going to be pushback from the manufacturers of the bad anesthetic.
Oh, there has been. When I started presenting this, they came up with their own advertisements directly against us, saying, well, listen, this represents as a very small portion of the total greenhouse gases released in the atmosphere. In fact, if you look at how much is clear to Canada, it only represents about, if you got rid of all the DESFLURANE in Canada, you'd only be taking out about 2 to 2.5% of all of what the greenhouse gases are from coal plants. So that has been their advertisement. This doesn't really matter. That this is actually a small percentage. But the thing is, if you don't believe in 2 to 2.5%, then why are we even as Canadians doing anything? Because we represent less than that, the total greenhouse gas emissions as a country, globally. Every amount matters. If we all do this within our own practices, we can make a difference. If you remember, I started this based on the fact that we was trying to reduce the carbon footprint of my practice. Dr. Blacklock showed me something that I didn't know, and that was that Ventolin and other types of inhalers are associated with a high carbon footprint, et cetera, et cetera. So why this is important is that we all should be looking into our practices and making a difference. There's no question that DESFLURANE doesn't want this data circulated. Our hospital, as well as many hospitals, have actually already gotten rid of them. They may actually be a point where they just get rid of the drug.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Go ahead, Brian.
Hi, Dr. Mathur. Thank you for the presentation. It's certainly informative. My question is also, Virginia is asking the same in the chat. What contributed to the prevalence and penetration of DESFLURANE currently within the hospital networks, particularly as you've shown that it doesn't confer any clinical benefit, that certainly doesn't justify its carbon footprint, nor if the carbon pricing is implemented its price?
That's an excellent question. And, asking me is almost unfair because it doesn't make sense to me. And obviously our hospitals got rid of it. But they have been very effective at marketing themselves as an agent where the patient does wake up much more quickly. And if you wish to practice by just, putting a patient to sleep, turning the drug off, turning drug on, and then turning it off at the very end of case, it probably is a bit quicker. Now, being a little quicker to wake up is it clinically significant if you don't get out of recovery sooner? Is it clinically significant if we're talking about 1.5 minutes out of a 3-hour operation? Probably not. So I think it's just because people have used the drug. It does have some advantages in terms of waking a patient up a little bit more quickly, but not of any clinical significance. They've tried real hard and trying to justify this drug as being better than sevoflurane. Two areas where they do say they feel they may have some advantage, but has not been shown in literature, is morbidly obese patient because it does not get stored in fat, which sevoflurane does, and in patients who have pretty significant cognitive aging effects. And of course, we have old elderly patients. So they've also marketed themselves for that, but studies don't bear that out. So it's going to come down to just making sure people realize that the studies don't bear that out, Brian.
For sure, thank you. And I can certainly appreciate too. I work as a physiotherapist, so I can appreciate the other side. If a patient is able to wake up faster, but it's about how much meaningful and clinical significance, like is it minutes or hours or anything like that. So thank you so much for answering the question.
No problem. I want to add too that DESFLURANE has lots of things you can't do with it. As a matter of fact, you can't use it in children, you can't use it in people with reactive airway disease. So sevoflurane can do all those things, and desflurane is limited. That's just another add-on.
Wonderful. Please go ahead, Harisha. Anyone wishing to turn on their video can as well. It's been enabled. Go ahead, Harisha.
Hi there, Kathy and Sanj. It's Banu, actually. I'm logged on under Harisha's laptop. Thank you for a really informative talk. Thanks for the introduction, Kathy, and for the talk, Sanj. One of the slides you alluded to is other countries having a much lower, the hospitals having a much lower carbon footprint. You mentioned Cambridge, Addenbrooke Hospital in Cambridge. Now, other countries use more in the way of intravenous anesthesia, and which North America seems to be slow on the uptake of that. Is there anything we can do in North America to introduce more intravenous anesthesia, like targeted controlled infusions, which we're kind of familiar with in Europe and the rest of the world?
It's an excellent conversation we had the other day too. So what Dr. Nallas is saying is that you don't even have to use anesthetic gases. We could actually just theoretically get rid of anesthetic gases altogether and use intravenous anesthetics to keep people asleep. It would be a huge shift in the practice, but certainly would be safe and something that we do. I think that there are people in the groups that I am, the environmental sustainability units, who actually do take that opinion, that we should just get all anesthetic gases should be phased out. If you take into consideration propofol, which is the other major drug that we'd have to use to keep people asleep, there is some ecotoxicity of propofol itself. It isn't in terms of greenhouse gases, it is in terms of water toxicity. If you just throw propofol into the garbage, or it's discarded down a sink, etc., it does get into the ecosystem, and it has been measured in marine animals. The only two places that propofol doesn't get damage to the atmosphere: in the patient, so you don't waste any and you make sure all of their drug ends up in the patient, or two, you burn it. And that's what we do here in Sudbury, or most places. If you have a little extra propofol, it's put into yellow bins and it's burned. But unfortunately, it takes 1,000 degrees Celsius to get rid of a propofol. So I think those are bad reasons not to switch to propofol from an environmental impact, but that is some of the things quoted by the gas industry. I think literally, Dr. Nala, it comes down to the fact that people just aren't as used to doing it. You guys are far more in tune with doing TIVA or total intravenous anesthetics in the UK, and North America has been traditionally a gas-based anesthetic.
Wonderful. Jeffrey, go ahead. And Sanj, you can stop sharing your screen so we can see everybody.
Oh.
It's lovely, if you wish.
No problem. There you go.
Hi, first of all, thanks very much for a really informative presentation. It's amazing to see how various sectors can have an effect, the cumulative, which cumulatively really will make a big difference. I'm assuming that there's no consumer choice as patients in terms of what anesthetic that you take, and I'm wondering how the people here, not in the medical field, but as patients, how we can act on this knowledge that you've just given us and move to encourage or move to the more environmentally friendly anesthetics.
I'll lead off that by saying that when I gave this presentation to Mercedes Kinlan, she wrote down the drug sevoflurane, and when she went to her pre-admission clinic said, I don't want this drug desflurane because it has a bad environmental impact. And the anesthesiologist was well aware of it and said, okay, no, I won't give it to you. But so, yeah, you can do it. And certainly, I don't think an anesthesiologist would argue with you. But I think you're right, people just don't know about it. I mean, I've put it out in the public. I've been on CBC, I put it in the newspaper. I was lucky enough that Elaine, one of her great articles, put it like, but again, I think most people don't write the names of the drugs down and take that kind of a lead. Maybe Jeffrey, as an anesthesiologist, one of the things I could have done was put a poster in the pre-admission clinic saying, do you know that one of our anesthetic drugs, has a tremendous footprint? Ask your anesthesiologist about it. I suppose I could try that in Toronto as a bit of a trial. It's not a bad idea.
Thank you.
A wonderful story about Mercedes. Are there any other questions? Go ahead, please, Saeed.
Hi, Dr. Mathur. Hi, everyone. Syed Ali Abbas from Toronto. I just want to say thank you for the talk, and it's nice to see you finally.
Yes.
You've been an inspiration. As you may have heard, we got rid of Des from our formulary just a few weeks ago. Thank you for the work you did. And I didn't have to go through that many steps, but it just took a while to go from nothing to a complete removal. But the timing was right. The timing was right, and it happened. And to your point of the pre-admit, we've talked about trying to maybe get some posters in, talk to your anesthesiologist about more sustainable options, because these are things that resonate with people's values. And if they ask, we can do regional anesthesia or TIVA and stuff like that. But yeah, these things are definitely going to be parts of conversations, I think, going forward.
Thank you very much for attending, Syed, and of course your great work in the GGA. And I think that's a great idea. I hadn't thought of it until someone just asked for it now, and I didn't know you were doing that. But I think Jeffrey had mentioned it. But I think that there are a lot more patients who would be concerned about this. And so a well-worded poster. What do you think, Kathy? You're out there too. Do you think it just get ripped down by an upset an anesthesiologist who doesn't like this? Kathy Lacroix is not going to say anything there.
Well, that brings me to a point that we would like to develop an action team coming out of tonight's call. If any of you do lobby your members of parliament and they do show interest in pushing forward on creating maybe some sort of nonpartisan team to push this through parliament, that would be lovely. I was speaking today with our friends over at Eco Justice, and when they looked at ending thermal coal, whatever, I don't know what it was, but it was a no-brainer for Parliament, and they did it. So I think this should be a no-brainer for Parliament as well. So anyone interested in forming an action team going forward to come up with maybe a poster, because sometimes you do need that little bit of education before you can actually put a forcing function or people push back. So I think, and also working with parliamentarians. With this, that's a great question, and maybe Sanj can answer that in the chat. If you can look over in the chat, Sanj, that's a good question. And I can answer it too, if you, but it's about provincial. Should we be lobbying our provincial MPPs as well? So in Ontario, we're about to go into an election, so it's very hard to get anything done, but you can try. We are hoping that it will happen federally, so then it will just be automatic across all provinces. But if we get resistance there, I think we would go provincially. Did you want to add to that, Sanj? You're muted.
Yeah. We were directed to go speak to the Ministry of the Environment side. I think, would you agree with us that our politicians are to be federal, and that the greenhouse gas inventory is a federal thing? And all of us, including his group and my group and all that, have sent letters, talked to deputy people in the Ministry of the Environment, Climate Change, but have yet to have enough of an impact with the politicians. They seem interested, but I think we need that to further. We need to take it to the next level with our lobbying efforts.
Yeah, I agree. I think it needs to be done federally, especially because the greenhouse gas inventory is a federal thing. Ontario, I don't even know if they have a climate change act like BC does. There is an election coming. Nothing's going to move in Ontario, but there's a lot of momentum federally, especially with the new Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act and such. So I think federally, there may be a better way to go, and I think also the proper way to go right now.
The Ontario government tried this when we had Diane Sachs as the environmental commissioner, and she actually published a report about greenhouse gases and anesthetic gases. And then I worked with her group a bit, and they requested all the sales data from Abbott, who makes Sevo, and Baxter, who make, the manufacturers that make these drugs. And of course, they were not forthcoming, and it was going to be a bit of a legal battle. But I think the federal government has a lot more power. And that was the implication, that was what she told me at that time. That the federal government gets on this, they'll be able to get that information much more readily.
Go ahead, Kath, and then Jane.
So with the report that we just got, was today, was it about the from the auditor that said that Ontario is not anywhere near reaching their goals? This might be an easier win, because if Ontario just said, forget it, we're not using it, they could, you know, do a little bit better in a very easy way. So it might be a time to do it now. But with the posters, I think they would read them before they tore them down, Sanj. And if you had somebody that was persistent and went and put up another one every time they tore it down, then you'd get something. The other thing that I was thinking is, you know, in Toronto, the university hospitals are kind of competitive with their reputations, especially. And I used to work at Sunnybrook, and I noticed Sunnybrook has the worst amount there. So if you maybe could do an op-ed or something and name the names of the worst, that would, you know, might spur them on a little bit. And of course, money's always a big draw, or, you know, big motivator.
You're muted.
Oh, shoot.
Well, we were at COP, Sanj. Didn't one of the hospitals remove DESFLURANE from the formulary in Toronto? Didn't we get a?
Oh, yeah, there's been some success now. Some of them are starting to remove it all throughout the province. So yes, I believe so.
So there you go. We've got the competition going, Kath. Great idea. Okay, go, Jane.
I'm sorry it's a bit late coming to this presentation, Sanj, but has CAPE been approached?
Yeah, really good.
Because
They're really
within
doing well
Ontario,
here.
they are gathering some momentum,
They
and
put on,
they have some new leadership provincially.
put on
CAPE
some
stands for
shows.
Canadian Association for Physicians for the Environment.
uh,
And at any rate, they have been
did they?
successful in some of their lobby efforts. Have they been approached? And of course, they tend to be almost all of CAPE. You don't have to be, but they tend to be mostly physicians.
Yeah. I never approached CAPE personally. I'm not sure how much of a, I'm sure they would be helpful. I mean, but we haven't approached them. We decided to go through in Ontario, for example, and in Alberta, we went through the OMA and
really?
the Alberta Medical Association, whatever it's called. And they actually form groups and committees that are working towards giving a strong message to hospitals. So, but we have not used CAPE. I have not used CAPE.
I guess so, eh? But
Just a suggestion, it might be another tool.
Yeah, no,
I think I like
We did meet up with Joe Vipond
Like his
at
stuff
COP,
more
though.
than-
Oh, yeah,
who's the
yeah.
current president of CAPE,
Mhm.
and you
Yeah.
did meet with Courtney, who was the former president at CAPE. So
Mhm.
and I did talk. So yeah, I should say I did talk to her about it, but it wasn't like she said, "Oh, I'll take this." I mean, CAPE has a lot of things going on, and this tends to be a little bit less specific to what they actually probably know. She's probably not that comfortable talking about anesthesia gases to politicians. But as you know,
Right.
lobbying is all about just giving
Right.
a brief handout, relationship building, the truth,
Yeah,
etc.
yeah.
So I think CAPE could be definitely
I know
involved. Yeah, thank you,
tomorrow
Jane.
is,
I'll look at that.
it's their-
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, do you mind, sorry, if you have a reference list, I would love that as well, if that's okay.
A what list? Sorry.
Reference list.
Oh,
someone
absolutely,
said-
absolutely.
Yes, that'd be amazing. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, is that it?
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. See you in a couple of weeks on the CCL Canada monthly calls, and it's one lovely meeting, all of you. Thank you so much, Sanj, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you.
You, Syed.
Thank you.